We've got a history file for you. Believe it or not, 237 years ago, the battles of Lexington and Concord took place. Now, I assume that most American history courses in high school at least mention Lexington and Concord, but probably don't really get into it a great deal. So I thought we could spend a few minutes with someone who knows a little bit more than what is taught in our high schools about Lexington and Concord. Very pleased to have with us on the program Dr. David Rainey, Associate Professor of History at Hillsdale College, and I am pleased to say that I met Dr. Rainey at the NRA annual meetings in St. Louis. How you doing, Dr. Rainey?
I'm doing well, Cam, and I want to thank you very much for having me on. It's my pleasure and my honor, sir.
Absolutely. When I remembered what today was, I thought about meeting you and thought, well, I'm going to give him a call and see if we can get him on the program. So I've got to ask, first of all, the students that come into Hillsdale, I'd like to think that they're a little bit a cut above, perhaps, when it comes to American history and their knowledge of American history. But do you find that things like Lexington and Concord really aren't being taught in our nation's schools?
That's a great question, and quite frankly, the answer is yes. We are finding that. Unfortunately, a lot of students who even come to Hillsdale have had, I would say, an inadequate background as far as the basics of our own history. And now that's not to discredit a lot of the backgrounds that our students have. A lot of them come from good schools, and even some public schools are still teaching this stuff. But unfortunately, as years go by, we find that fewer and fewer schools are really focusing on even some of the key leaders of our republic in its earliest days. George Washington often gets short shrift. Thomas Jefferson, they may be mentioned, but they're often glossed over. Or sometimes they're demonized as bad guys, being slave owners and whatnot. So we are finding that fewer and fewer students as years go by have a sort of grounding that we expect a citizen to have in a very important aspect of our past.
Absolutely. So, I mean, when it comes to the battles of Lexington and Concord, what are some of the things that you think people should know about?
Well, it's a great question. I think, first of all, they have to realize that the Battle of Lexington really began with an attempt to subdue what was seen as a growing revolt in the Massachusetts countryside at that time. And in 1775, a number of local groups had gotten together. They had formed militias, not for nefarious offensive purposes, but rather to defend themselves in the likelihood of a British attack. And so the governor of Massachusetts at that time, who was General Thomas Gage, he decided to do something about it. And, of course, on the night of April 18th, 1775, he actually sent a detachment to attempt to seize firearms and ammunition in the town of Concord, which is about 18 miles west of Boston. Mm-hmm. And that, of course, became, as we know, an ill-fated venture. Word immediately leaked out that he was attempting to do that. And as the troops began moving into the countryside, writers such as Paul Revere and William Dawes famously went out and announced that the Redcoats were in fact on their way. And even ironically, some of Gage's own men began talking ahead of time and were leaking information. And so it was no secret they were on their way. But of course, when they got to Lexington first, they found a detachment of maybe 70 or so militiamen who put up a resistance. But initially, these militiamen, interestingly enough, they began to disperse after being told to do so by the British forces. But the fact that they refused to disarm as part of that dispersal resulted in the initial clash, in which about 8 of these men were killed, 10 were wounded, and one British private was grazed in the leg. So much for heavy British casualties. But right. As we also know, and this is the final point that I'll make, as the British attempted to retreat after having made its way to Concord and basically finding very little ammunition, very little powder, it had all been either moved or hidden in safe places like ladies' bedchambers, places the British troops wouldn't dare go to look for them. Mm-hmm. The British had to retreat back to Boston, and along the way, of course, famously, they were sniped at from behind rocks and trees and fences and that sort of thing. And after all was said and done, about 273 British casualties had mounted, and only about 95 Americans had been killed or wounded.
Absolutely. And, you know, and from that point, Dr. Rainey, you know, I think that some of us tend to think of history as, you know, a series of isolated events and isolated dates. But, you know, by the time the British went back into Boston, you had this army of New England that had sort of sprung up from nowhere, encircling the city of Boston, and it was the British that were all of a sudden unable to move. They were the ones who were in essence being held captive.
That's exactly right. It's very, very perceptive. That's precisely what happened. And, of course, as word about what happened at Lexington and, of course, Concord began spreading, individuals who, up until that point, had really not paid much attention to the conflict or felt as though it really wasn't their fight, they literally began pouring out of the woodwork. And as a result, these local militia companies began expanding greatly. And, of course, late in the spring, the Continental Congress reconvened in May. They authorized the formation of the famous Continental Army, ultimately placed Washington at the head of that. And as you suggested, they were able to surround the city of Boston to the point where early in 1776, the British felt that discretion is the better part of valor, and they ultimately, at least temporarily, of course, left and hope to come back and fight again. But yes, this resulted in you can say an electric effect across not only Massachusetts, but also importantly other colonies as well. Up and down the seaboard, people looked at Massachusetts and said, well, but for the grace of God go we. The same sorts of things the British have tried to do against our brethren in Massachusetts, they could try to do the same thing in our colony. So we better come together and attempt to present a united front against these depredations.
Absolutely. So the stories we hear, Dr. Rainey, of guys who actually stopped what they were doing, stopped the plow in the middle of the field and ran back to their home to grab their musket and start to march. Did that really happen?
It certainly did. That is no exaggeration at all. In fact, the famed Minutemen who did come together in Lexington and also in Concord, they were just that. They were ordinary citizens who typically were farmers, artisans, small shopkeepers. They essentially left their day jobs, so to speak, to do something that they felt was of much more importance. And so, yes, this was a citizen effort, ultimately citizen-led, but certainly the idea was that they would leave their professions for a limited time, go off and serve what even by 1775 many were calling their country, and they were willing to give the ultimate sacrifice to do so.
Talking with Dr. David Rainey from Hillsdale College, and I'm always struck when I think about the sacrifices that those men and their families went through, because again, they had no idea how long they would be gone. When Paul Revere took off on his midnight ride on April 18th, I don't think he realized it'd be 11 months later before he got back to his house in Boston, Massachusetts. This was, this would have been, I think, an exciting time for them, obviously, but it had to have been a very unsettling time for these men and women too.
Well, it certainly was, Cam. That's a very important point. One thing that people often forget is that in the aftermath of Lexington and Concord, and also, of course, even, for example, the Battle of Bunker Hill, as it's moving into May and then June of 1775, there was a great deal of confusion among the colonists as to what their ultimate aims truly were. And there were some, of course, like the Adams cousins, John Adams and his cousin Samuel Adams, who clearly were leaning in favor of independence. But there were others, people like John Dickinson, the famous statesman from Pennsylvania, who were certainly circumspect. They were quite intelligent people, and they urged caution. They hoped for a quick reconciliation with the mother country. And so it really, throughout much of 1775, most of these colonists were hoping for, at bare minimum, what they considered a restoration of their traditional rights. In other words, rights that they felt guaranteed by their colonial charters, rights that they felt were guaranteed by nature, and also, of course, by the British Constitution. And so they were hoping for a restoration of those rights. And it really wasn't until early 1776, and of course the publication of Thomas Paine's famous pamphlet, Common Sense, that the tide really began to turn heavily in favor of independence. But yes, all along this brought tremendous changes to families, and if you look at some of the colonies, particularly, for example, in New Jersey, there were substantial populations of so-called loyalists, those who remained loyal to the British Crown, and even William Franklin, Ben Franklin's son, he was a famed loyalist and was jailed for several years during the Revolutionary War, much to the chagrin of his father. So it became certainly a war that divided families, divided populations and towns, and so it was in some ways a civil war as well.
I think absolutely. I mean, again, particularly, until you get to independence, which, as you say, that happened more than a year after the events at Lexington and Concord. So there was that
Right.
that very tumultuous, chaotic period when you knew you were fighting, but you didn't quite know what the ultimate aim was going to be. That's why I think this time period in our nation's history is absolutely fascinating. There are so many, not just events, but there are so many individuals that played such instrumental roles who have such incredibly rich and detailed lives that we can learn about.
No question about that. And there's one, I know we're probably running short on time, but there's one individual that I would really urge your listeners to look into if they find some time. His name was Joseph Plum Martin. And you can, I don't know if you've ever read his narrative, Cam, but it's simply called A Narrative of a Revolutionary Soldier. And it gives a fascinating account of what the average American soldier in the Continental Army faced. Not what the officers faced, but what the average soldier faced day in and day out. Privations, lack of food, lack of proper clothing. He had one blanket throughout much of the war, and he had to choose whether he would actually lay on the ground and use it to separate himself from the cold ground, or use it as a covering for his body. And he was always looking for things to eat. He was reduced at one point to eating cow entrails, and even gnawing on a stick to try to obtain nutrient value from the bark. So these are the types of things that I want to make sure my students don't forget. The types of sacrifices that have essentially provided the republic we have today, and I remind them that without continuing sacrifice, certainly on the part of our brave men and women in uniform, but also every citizen, without everybody's sacrifice, our republic is in danger, and we have to keep that in mind.
Absolutely. Dr. David Rainey from Hillsdale College, thank you again, sir, for coming on the program. Fantastic talking to you, and hope we can do it again.
Well, likewise, sir. It's been my pleasure, and I thank you for it.